All right, and we are back, hopefully with another exciting episode of Content Minded. And I did go out and buy a microphone that connects to my iPhone, and so hopefully the audio is much clearer. It's got one of those little wind filters on it, although you probably can still hear some audio of, me driving. But there's a truck. But I'll try to be it's good because it's right there and I don't have to shout into my phone that's on the one of those little doohickeys that holds it up, phone holder. And I think I can be more organic, and I do notice that on DA and also on last night I was recording with Last Things. We were recording a film review for his film festival on Itchy the Redactor. I don't know if I could say that if this becomes a public, Itchy the K-word, which is a great film, and we went over a lot of themes that are related to what Bataille talks about in eroticism, because Itchy is not like your usual blood and guts, thrash, thriller, thrasher, slasher film, I mean, it takes blood and guts to like a comical absurdity, but nevertheless, I mean, it is a great film, and there is like a verve to it that, isn't like a lot of typical like slasher films that do verge on the dark comedic, but don't have a lot of the, how shall I say it, Oedipalized themes that are intimately related to the death drive and also the pleasure principle. And people dispute whether Freudianism is an apt... I think Freudianism, in terms of cultural criticism, in terms of sociology, I would say had a lot of concepts that are useful. And even though I'm a Jungian, even though when it comes to the makeup of the psyche, I think Freud was deeply flawed, to say the least. But in terms of his model... I mean, he was flawed in his model of dream analysis. He was flawed in his model of the structures of the unconscious, because he was only analyzing a part of the unconscious. And so I think that even as a Jungian, but I could still find the value in things like the pleasure principle, and then the nirvana or the thanatos principle, the death drive, which is very evident, and this is what I wanted to talk about. But of course you will have to subscribe to the Last Things Film Festival to hear the review. I think maybe he gives them some of them for free eventually, but we'll see. So this episode, if you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe, and do all that stuff. Please support me on Patreon and Substack. I do want to grow the Substack subscriptions, because I noticed that, and they're both only $5 a month, but of course on Patreon I do have to get out the rewards. I've been lagging. On Patreon there's a $20 tier and a $50 tier. But I do think Substack is a sort of like, for, especially Gen Xers, it's more of like a free and easy thing. And eventually I will publish paywalled articles, or like, what I do this model now, like half free, half paywalled. Because, but the written word does take me a lot of time in editing, and I just am more natural when it comes to podcasting. And I like that I have a microphone now, because I have a more natural voice, because I do notice, like, the reason I mention this is because I do notice that my voice is quite strained, like when I'm going on for a long rant with another person. I could feel it in my throat, because I have this sort of, I guess you could say, an excitement, and I just have to like belt it out. But here, I don't have to belt it out as much as if you've been following the Core Report, to which I'm recording these driving segments. You notice that like I'm sort of like belting it out, but maybe it's not as noticeable to me as it is to you in a recorded medium. But that's what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to title this episode Antinormieanism because I've been reading a lot of literature that deals with the concept of antinomianism, which in theology and in religious studies refers to, I mean, it originates in Christianity, but then of course you could say that various practices in the East, both in Hinduism and Buddhism, have a flair of what you could term, like basically fits the connotation of antinomianism, which means that you are no longer bound by the moral law. You are not bound by the laws towards corporeal existence and behavior, and rather you are either in an enlightened position or through a position of predestination that bars you from the moral law. And there's a lot of complicated structures. And for example, there were a sect of Christians that were heretical Christians that would use the letters of St. Paul as a form of antinomianism. But as Paul makes it very clear, it was in one passage where he says, this is a complicated work that would require understanding. St. Paul says that you really can't get out of the moral law. In Buddhism, it becomes very complicated. But I'll get to Buddhism, but in Christianity, you have antinomianism that expresses itself in things like, well, if you are saved by divine grace, then therefore the moral laws such as the Ten Commandments, or in Catholicism and in Orthodoxy you have the Beatitudes. Do they have Beatitudes in Orthodoxy? I'm not sure. I know that's like a normie mistake, but I'm sorry. And the whole the whole point of this podcast is that we are living through a social and materialized form of antinomianism that takes a variety of forms. So, there's some road work ahead. I mean, there was some road work getting to the bridge, but we'll see. And so anyways, there is there's like some water truck that's being a slowpoke. All these all of these other trucks are like, anyways, I'll try to maintain the road commentary to a minimum. So in Christianity, you have the concept of antinomianism that expresses itself like through faith alone and through divine providence or predestination, but also in non-Calvinist or non-Protestant, post-Martin Luther, or rather pre-Martin Luther iterations in various like Gnostic Christian sects and various even within the Catholic Church. Within Orthodoxy, there's certain conglomerations of old believers that have these very crazy rituals that involve mass orgiastic activity, if you know what I mean. But there are a number of biblical arguments against antinomianism that are in various councils. And in Protestant Christianity, though, please don't say I'm an authority in theology or Protestant theology in particular. I have friends who are, but in Protestantism, there is, of course, a number of sola scriptura arguments against antinomianism to say that, in fact, even within Calvinism, you are adherent to biblical law, you are adherent to the commandments of God, even if there is a form of predestination. But there have always been the sort of antinomian impulse that is tied to mysticism and to the sacred. And this is what Bataille would also say, is that transgression, divinity, the sacred, and the nature of eroticism go hand in hand. And it is often that antinomianism expresses itself in the erotic. And so in the words of Bataille, there is a lot of crossovers there, because all of these things essentially imply a dissolution of the self. or a bracketing of the self. Even in a system such as Buddhism, there still are antinomian practices, because Buddhism is not a dissolution of the self, it's the realization of the non-self, or the realization of the mutual origination of the self, that the self is but a construct, that in there is no underlying essence or hypostasis to the self, because the self is thrown into the world. And again, I'm using Heideggerian language to describe it, because because I was lucky enough in university to have a Taoist and Chinese art professor in philosophy who was a Heideggerian as well. So I mean, Heidegger, especially the later Heidegger, comes very close. But to not confuse you, in Buddhism, you have forms of antinomianism that expresses itself in the transgressions of the body, because there is, like, despite what hippies say, there is like quite a bit of like moral laws within Buddhism and within Hinduism and so the way they get around it, from my understanding, and don't quote me, but if you have various like thinkers that have been very popular in the West in philosophy, such as Rupala or Kalapahana, when it comes to Theravada Buddhism, or it comes to the works of Nagarjuna, where, okay, the schema is that if you are not bound to the sort of dictates of an egoic self, of the ahamkara, as it is in Buddhism, if you are, sorry, not in Buddhism, Hinduism, the ahamkara, if there is no self, then what is there to transgress? And then, of course, there's a lot of very infamous works, such as the book Buddhists at War, that Zizek talks about, where they could say that, well, war and destruction and so forth, and nationalism in Buddhism is justified because there is no self to transgress upon. But there's a lot of militant forms of Buddhism, especially in Tibet and in Japan. But you do have this awareness of that there still is a moral law, especially in Mahayana Buddhism. But yet, in the more mystical iterations of Buddhism, such as in Theravada, you do have a lot of tantric practices and a lot of practices of eating meat and so forth that you would consider antinomian, that would transgress against the moral law, or against proper what they would call proper dharma, and adharma or adharma, which is the inverse of dharma, which is the improper activities, that at a certain stage of enlightenment, a certain stage of realizing the non-self, that you would say there is no longer a need for these laws. There's no longer a need for dharma. Because in Buddhism, they have a saying, I believe comes from Zen Buddhism, but it applies to various schools, such as the various schools of Mahayana Buddhism was very popular in East Asia, Indochina, what they would call Indochina, and of course in Theravada Buddhism and various other schools of Tibetan Buddhism. They have this notion that once you carry the raft over to the other side, there's no need for the raft anymore. You don't bring the raft. I mean, yeah, okay, some ventures you do bring the raft with you, but in a lot of cases you leave the raft at the shore, meaning that you leave in the language of Mahayana Buddhism, you leave the little vehicles for the greater vehicle. And the greater vehicle is understood as reaching that state of being a bodhisattva. And there are little, moral laws that have to do with activity in this world, although you wouldn't say that there's like a distinction in Buddhism like there is in Christianity or other metaphysical systems between the world here and the other world. Buddhism remains aporic in those questions of like, what is the other world? What is the afterlife, man? Or is it just an endless series of reincarnations until you step off the wheel of samsara and you no longer reincarnate? What does that look like? Right? That looks like an awareness of the totality of nature being a product of shunyata, which is emptiness, which is mutual origination. It's not emptiness in terms of annihilative emptiness. It's not that there's nothing. It's not like an atheistic emptiness, although there is atheistic Buddhists and Hindus such as Sharvakas in Hinduism. But it's not, you wouldn't call it like our Western notions of like emptiness, that there's a nothing, that when you die there's no longer anything there. There's no real language to describe it. But in Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism, they would say that the little vehicle of Dharma, or various forms of Dharma and various forms of conscious and moral laws, that then gets abandoned for once you've reached the greater vehicle. And then you become a bodhisattva. But the bodhisattva, you have to remember, keeps him or her or itself, because really there's no engendered nature. For example, Avalokiteshvara is depicted as both a man and a woman, or at various times a woman or a man. It doesn't really matter. And then a lot of like Westernoid leftists that look into Buddhism, they're like, oh, that means our, you know, identity politics of being a transformer is like totally valid, but whatever. That's a very politicized and I would even say materialist interpretation of Buddhism from the perspective of like modern like identity politics of a certain variety. So that's a different issue. But you would say, but the argument from what I know in Mahayana Buddhism, because I remember this would always come up, especially when I was an undergrad, this would always come up in class. They would say like, well, if you're no longer adherent to Dharma, to proper law, to proper laws of the Buddha, and that's outlined in various sutras in the Pali Canon and the Flower Sutra, but then of course you have more mystical sutras such as the Flower Garland, sorry I was thinking of Lotus Sutra, but then you have more mystical ones such as the Flower Garland Sutra that talks about the 10,000 Buddha lands. And then of course you have other schools of Buddhism such as Pure Land Buddhism that come very close to, you would say, a metaphysics, or very close to treating the Buddha as a Gautama Buddha as a Christ-like figure. But maybe one day I'll discuss Pure Land Buddhism, because in Pure Land there is a Japanese school of Pure Land, what's it called, Shoho or something, I forget the exact name, that comes very close to Antinomianism, that comes very close to various tantric practices that you would find in Theravada Buddhism in Tibet. But barring that aside, I remember in class there would be these arguments about, well, if there's a transgression, not transgression, but if there's an abandoning of Dharma, once you have reached a certain level of non-attachment, and once you've realized a certain level of Shunyata, or in Hinduism you have moksha, in Buddhism you have nirvana, once you have reached that stage of the realization of stepping off the life world of samsara, life, birth, rebirth, and death, and so forth, wouldn't you like then wouldn't that give you license to do whatever you want? Wouldn't it give you, and of course there are antinomian mystical schools and sects in Buddhism that would say yes. And in Hinduism you have various schools such as the Agorai, who, like, you know, they live in garbage heaps, they drink out of skulls, they eat meat or consume cattle, right? And of course they say that vegetarianism in India is way overplayed. They still eat meat, it's just they don't eat cattle. But then you have the consumption of cattle, of beef, in the agoric schools, in various rituals. And of course all of them have very similar tantric actual practices, if you know what I mean. But the response by scholars and by great Buddhist people that have been claimed to achieve Buddhahood, such as Nagarjuna, their response would be that if you achieve a level of nirvanic insight, if you are that level to where you are approaching Buddhahood, right? Such as the Bodhisattva consciously keeps him or herself in this world of samsara by doing like little practices of attachment. Not that they go and screw everybody or whatever, but little practices here and there. I believe the Dalai Lama, he attaches himself to I think he like does a needlepoint or something. I forget, like something stupid, right? He collects spoons or something that keeps him in this world of samsara. And they would say that if you've achieved that level, that if you are a Buddha, you have no need for any antinomian or any transgressive practice. Like, for example, actual appetitive things like indulgences, usually indulgences of the body in every which way. You realize that there's no use in doing any of those things. So, in a way, it keeps you from that antinomian impulse, the way that you could say that in Christianity, especially in Protestant Christianity and Calvinism, you could say that those bodily transgressions, that there's no use for them anymore, because you still are subject to the moral law. But the reason the reason I was looking into this is because I was reading this Mark Kozlow essay, and I believe he passed away recently this year, who was a painter and a religious scholar who studied under Houston Smith and who studied under Rama Kumaraswamy, which I believe is the oldest son of Ananda Kumaraswamy that he had with his first wife. He became a follower of Fritjof Schuon. And Fritjof Schuon had a very crazy, weird cult around him that, of course, revolved around you-know-what. Because a lot of cults at its base have a lot of, let's call them SA practices for YouTube purposes. A lot of things that were very sussy baka when it comes to pleasures of the body and the flesh. He had this thing where he was worshiping the female anatomy, if you know what I mean. And he declared himself equal to various religious figures throughout the ancient world, whether it be Gautama Buddha, Christ, and Muhammad. Of course, he converted to Islam, but he had a very antinomian form of Islam that wouldn't pass in any sort of like Sunni or Shiite school, and even in the more mystical iterations of Islam, such as Sufism or 12-hour Islam, there still is a lot of moral laws. It's not as extreme as Wahhabism, but of course it is expressed in the greater jihad of the self, right? So even within Sufism, where they do imbibe in certain things like hashish, and they do have a lot of dervish dancing and mystical practices that approach forms of shamanic practice, they don't go around doing like tantric whatever. You know what I mean? Like, it's not their style. But Fritjof Schuon was doing these things, and he had multiple wives, and his wives would like take care of him, and would they would basically be at his beck and call at every need. And he would do these dances that were an appropriation both of dervish dancing, of Sufi practices, but also a butchering and appropriation of North American indigenous ritual dancing, where he would like in Indiana, was it Indiana? Yeah. He would like take all of the wives, and he would dance with them, he would fondle them up, and he would do these different very creepy practices, and of course he was sleeping with a lot of them. with or without their consent, if you know what I mean. And he had these very, I would even say, definitely blasphemous attitudes towards, for example, the Virgin Mary. And because he was a trained artist, him and his wife, what was her name? Bundia, or Bondria, I forget her exact name, but they would all have names that were derivative of Hindu or Islamic names that were of religious significance. And he had these like crazy wardrobes that he would wear, and he had all of these different attitudes in his painting, and he would have like basically kind of like an appropriation of Eastern Orthodox iconography, where some paintings were for like public consumption and others were to be hidden only for the inner circle. And then there were some paintings of him in the nude that his wife or him would paint, and they would paint nudes of each other that were only for their consumption, or for their eyes only, for Julie's eyes only, if you get that Christian reference. And so you would have this mysticism that was in essence, to Mark Kozlow, a covering up of a X cult, if you know what I mean. Sort of similar to NXIVM in some weird way, although NXIVM is like a self-help, like a secular self-help thing where there is like an appropriation of New Ageism, but there isn't a lot of focus on mysticism or on any sort of like metaphysical higher truth. Rather, it is like basically a self-help cult. If you study Keith Raniere and his various practices. So Antinomianism is, I believe he's writing a book, but the perennialist and the Sufi mystic Charles Upton has various videos being interviewed by Jeffrey Mishlove, or being interviewed by, I believe, this one Catholic perennialist YouTuber, where he talks about Fritjof Schuon's Antinomianism. And what's funny is that there's a lot of people on the E-right who are also a fan of Fritjof Schuon that also imbibe in a lot of different attitudes towards Islam, Sufism, mystical forms of Buddhism, that all are taken up in a reactionary lens. And of course, when you have such like transgressive attitudes towards the body and towards women, you can almost, like, in a weird way, justify reactionary politics from that lens of antinomianism. So I will, when I get home, I will actually read you passages from this essay. But to clarify, though, my position is that I still find value in the scholarship and especially the artwork and the poetry of Fritjof Schuon. But you have to realize that all of those works are taken with a grain of salt. Because all of those works, according to Mark Kozlow, were essentially there for his egoic, cult-like worship of his self. And the way that he was basically like an unreliable scholar. You know, like how in postmodern literature you have like the unreliable narrator? He was sort of like an unreliable scholar for religious texts because it was all about the worship of his own personage. And Mark Kozlow, he like uses a lot of passages in his poetry and in his greater works that support this claim. And so, even though there's immense amount of scholarship and insight into various world religions and to the perennial philosophy in general, you have to realize that at the end, you sort of have to bracket these like weirdo worshippings of Fritjof Schuon as a religious figure himself. And there's other perennialists from Coomaraswamy all the way to the modern day with Joseph Campbell that says that you have to be wary of people that are in the perennial philosophy that are going to create whole belief systems and sort of amalgamations of wisdom traditions that are centered around the worship of them or their selves. And so Osho, for example, created a cult around himself. Of course, I don't know if there were a number of actual practices and exploitations, but certainly, I mean, his follower, that woman took over a whole village in, what was it, Ohio or Oklahoma? I forget. I think it was in Ohio. So, you have to, like, really take these things with a grain of salt. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of a, I'm wetting the whistle with some water here. So, you have to take these things with a grain of salt, and you have to really be careful with anyone who claims to be a guru. Anyone who claims to have an insight into a mystical truth. Because a lot of the times, and this is what Joseph Campbell said about the East in his World Spirit series, he says you have to realize that in the East is kind of like Christianity with like big tent revival or televangelists, or like even nowadays you have like these libtard priests like James Martin who are selling you in a lot of ways a heretical version of Christianity. And I don't know why James Martin hasn't been excommunicated so far. I mean, I kind of know why, if you want to look into the history of the Pink Mafia in the Catholic Church, which is a very, I talked about it last time with that, was it last time or was it current? Yeah, I talked about it, I'll maybe include it in this episode, with the anime character that the Catholic Church has released, what's her name, Lucy. And, but so anyways, Joseph Campbell would said, like, listen, in the East you also have these charlatans and gurus who are selling you a bill of goods or want to exploit you in some way, that are basically forming cults around themselves by using those wisdom traditions in both Buddhism and Hinduism. And you always have to be careful, because the exoticism and the Orientalism that compels a lot of Westerners in the 60s and 70s and 80s, all the way up to the 90s, and even the 2010s, where you have millennials rediscovering a lot of New Ageism, but of the global South rather than the global East, where they're going to, they're taking various entheogens in the Amazon basin, and there's a lot of like psychedelia tourism, because you have all these millennials rediscovering the works of Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna especially, and they're rediscovering the works of Alan Watts, and you have all of this like mystical intrigue that then leads to what Terence McKenna would say, like, oh well, if you have this, like, really the key to all meaning, you really don't need a lot of other things. And I remember at the time being a New Ager that, well, doing a little experiments here and there with these certain substances. I remember that really resonated of like, well, if you have this key to all meaning, then why would you become anything else? Why would you become a Zen Buddhist or a communist or a Catholic or whatever? And I was thinking, like, wow, there is something to it if this really does provide an insight or a meaning into all things. But then over time you realize, well, actually it doesn't provide a meaning into all things, and it can cloud your judgment severely. And I still think there is sort of a value in it, because psychedelics does reveal the workings of the unconscious. But and this is something that Seraphim Rose talked about in Orthodoxy. He talked about this in nihilism. He goes, well, yeah, because he was in the New Age movement in San Francisco at the time before he converted to Orthodoxy. He actually took LSD and all these other substances. And he said, well, actually, if you are channeling real metaphysical entities or exoplanetary entities, which some theorists believe in the psychedelic movement, that intersect with the UFO movement, Seraphim Rose says, well, you don't know what you're contacting on the other side, the machine elves or whatever. And in fact, you could be contacting demonic forces. You could be contacting things that are beyond your comprehension, that you're not prepared to deal with. And so this is why he abandoned all of that, and he formed I believe he was part of the first Orthodox Church in North America. And of course, a lot of like Orthodox converts in the right, on the online right, a lot of them, I mean the lion's share of them, came from reading Seraphim Rose. And there was like a punk magazine, which in some ways strays towards a form of antinomianism, but still in keeping with a moral law. But it takes on the aesthetic affectations and signifiers of transgression that are present in the Western punk movement. And you have like magazines like Death to the World and so forth. And there's a very interesting history because of the realization of the mortification of the flesh within Orthodoxy, and there's a lot of like Platonic influences in Orthodox theology, whereas the Catholic Church is pretty like, they're pretty like hot up on Aristotle, and the Thomists were all Aristotelians and so forth. But there is a lot of Platonism in the East, because a lot of the Neoplatonists went to the East, or rather Asia Minor, what you would call Asia Minor, which is in Turkey, Eastern Europe, and so forth. That's when St. Paul talks about the letters to the 7 churches, or was it 9 churches in Asia? They meant Asia Minor, right? Would be like modern day Turkey or the Russian steppe or whatever. So you have this like seeming, and of course there is Orthodox sects that have carried with it certain forms of antinomianism. And there's a lot of like very hair-raising stuff, but Orthodoxy as a whole embraced the transgressive nature of the punk movement, but a transgression that is for the moral law, that is for Christ, for the teachings of Christ, that this world may be transgressed against with all of its materialism and worship of capital and worship of social conformism that leads you down the primrose path of amorality or even immorality. And so they saw something in the punk movement that totally transgressed against the sort of concerns of modern existence. And these punks, they were almost like these weirdo, like crazy wisdom mystics, because they were realizing a transgressive insight into the character and formation of the Western world in terms of society that they were rebelling against, but the rebellion needed a structure. From what I know about the magazine Death to the World, it's almost like in Zen Buddhism, they have the concept of the Zen wanderer, or the Furabu, who is like semi-homeless, who wanders from here and there, who lives a precarious existence by choice, and who is not concerned with like sort of material or mortal attachments. Because Eastern Orthodoxy, in a Christian and metaphysical framework, in its most mystical iterations, gets pretty close to that in the East. It gets pretty close to non-attachment. It gets pretty close to the awareness of that you are but flesh, and your soul will be delivered in keeping with Christ, and that the mortal concerns of the body, of material possessions, that they will be done away with eventually. And so, for example, you have the Orthodox congregation in Eastern Europe where they burn all of their possessions a few times every few years or so forth. I think once a year or so. And the whole cycle sort of like starts up again. But you have these, but I don't mean to do like a divine horseshoe theory, but if you read Bataille, if you read the antinomian practices that Fritjof Schuon was involved in, and a lot of other perennialists were involved in, even Julius Evola, being a radical traditionalist, but still being like this rootless artist boheme, especially in Berlin. You know, he was betting a lot of these aristocratic women and so forth. You have like a very complex relationship between both extreme moral purity and extreme amoral antinomian tantric practices, because the sacred and transgression go hand in hand, because profanation lowers something into use value. It takes something that is by definition useless, because the sacred, like sacred rituals, are quote unquote useless to the purview of utilitarian materialism, right? There's really no need materially to build a cathedral, but there's something higher there. There's no need to like expel all these resources, and the resources of scholarship of the body, but also resources of the soul, and sort of like spiritual energy on these religious practices. They're what Bataille talks about in The Accursed Share in Eroticism as waste and excess, but excess for a higher purpose. Eroticism is the excess of this, of this libidinal energy that culminates into the petite mort, the little death, right? The sort of the negation or the bracketing of the self that is in the erotic act, that through that erotic union comes about a dissolution of the self. And that is why there is a lot of moral laws, again, when in regards to actual activity, because it threatens to dissolve the subject as a whole. It threatens even to put the state of the soul in jeopardy, because you are subject to a bunch of influences outside of yourself. And so that is why there is such a connection between mysticism, eroticism, moral laws, and waste and excess, and profanation. So profanation, but when you, but the point being is that I will get more into it when it comes to Fritjof Schuon, when I have the material in front of me. But when it comes to the material world, that is very interesting. And let me take a little bit of a break, and we will get to what it means to transgress or to be an antinomian when it comes to the prevailing, people call it wokeness or whatever, but I call it the transnational progressive worldview. Global transnational progressivism. Or end of history neoliberalism, you could call it, which has taken up this complete moral system that has its hands in every single avenue of everyday life. This is stuff that I talk about in my book, Neoliberal Kitsch, Online Art and Aesthetics in the 21st Century. It really is about critiquing through aesthetics in the work of art, and through public art, the art that we are exposed to in everyday life, critiquing the prevailing world system that is now being called into question by these various right-wing nationalist movements. And what does it really mean to transgress against this complete world system that I wouldn't call a religion, but certainly has the sort of trappings and aesthetics and affectations of what it means to be in a religious system. It has the trappings of ritual, even though it doesn't have the aesthetics of things like Christianity or Buddhism or whatever. It appropriates the rituals and the modes of existence that are implied with a total faith structure. Because people don't think of it this way, because like modern day liberalism by creating the public-private distinction and by creating secularity, has, in a sense, toppled religion by creating that public-private distinction to where religion becomes a wholly private matter. It takes religion from the public realm because religious belief structures implies a whole world view. And it implies a political view because it is a totalization of life. How could religion not be a totalization of life if it implies the creation of the world, the creation of the soul, or rather the eternality of the soul, and then the community that is propped up by the religious order that is important for the state of the soul, but that state of the soul reflects the overarching civilization and or society around that soul or subject or individual. But now that you have secularism, that vacuum is then filled by the modern iterations, not the older forms of liberalism, with property rights and free association and meritocracy, values that were only expressed fully in European civilization. But now you have modern liberalism, which you could call transnational progressivism, that implies, that fills the void of that total system that religion once had. For example, in medieval Christianity or in Islam in the Arab world, now secularism eclipses those religious systems, but you still have, and this is what Jung said, in the absence of faith, you will have something else. And modern global liberalism or transnational progressivism, you can say, is that system, but it brings all of those things down to the eminentized material realm. There is no metaphysics, there is no transcendence. And this is why I disagree with all these intellectual dork web types like James Lindsay that say, well, they were all new atheists, right? Oh, wokeness is a religion. That's not true. There's no salvation in wokeness. There's no soteriology, what they call it, in quote-unquote wokeness, which is really just transnational progressivism. Even when you adhere to the moral laws of the, global, liberal, whatever people call it, wokeness, whatever, basically rainbow neoliberalism and, race idolatry and so forth, there's no salvation there. It's just the demand of what Heidegger called the they. The demand of the they being the greater other that is the social body that dictates your form of subjectivity. That's what it is. That is the command of the they. It is the order of the other. The other is integrated into yourself, and there is no escape. So really, it's not promising you salvation in a metaphysical sense, or even in the Buddhistic sense, because it's not like you're saying there is no self. There's a lot of leftoid academics that say, well, there's no real self. When you Derrida, what he talks about with difference, right? But there still is a self because the body is the site of power knowledge. This comes from Michel Foucault. But the soul is created by power, to Foucault, because power had to find, in the modern iterations of power from the 18th and 19th century onwards, these modern bodies of knowledge, creation, and sociology, and psychology, and social planning, all of these things had to create the self in order to infiltrate the self, to create this body of knowledge that then can be probed at and gathered by various sociological and psychological and anthropological schools and fields of knowledge creation. But what the modern left, after the new left, after Foucauldianism, after even Derrida and postmodernism or post-structuralism, what they didn't really account for is that they abandoned this claim to the non-self in a weird post-structuralist way, but retained the basis of identity politics by having this weird fundamentalism toward the machinations of the body. It's always the trans body, the black body. The body reveals the lesions and wounds of power, according to Michel Foucault. But what they didn't really retain is that the body is fundamentally a created thing. Because these modern, like, woke, whatever, these, like, modern, adherence to transnational progressivism, whether it be like, critical race theory or gender studies or so forth, they still treat the body as a very real object. In fact, it's the most real object because there's no soul. The soul is merely the expression of the inner cathetic workings of the self, of the body. So the body is then reintroduced as being hypostasized by the very identity complexes, meaning that the underlying essence of the self is through the body. Whereas Michel Foucault would say, no, there's no such thing as the body. The body is a creation of power knowledge. Because knowledge is an intimate working of what you think of as yourself. What you know, what information, and now that we're submerged in information networks, what you know, what informs the self. What you know to be the proper modes of disciplinary power, of knowledge creation, of social morality. All of those things require power knowledge. Because knowledge is created by power. What Foucault would call the regimes of truth. And then you would say you operate within these regimes of truth. So when it comes to mysticism, when it comes to eroticism, when it comes to the sacred, these things are then lowered into the material body by modern transnational progressivism. By modern quote-unquote woke, I hate that term woke, but like by modern like left liberal, radical liberal ideology. The body then takes the place of the soul. And so let us talk about, let's take a little break and then we will go to talking about if the body, not that wokeness is a religion the way the IDW thinks of it, the way that James Lindsay thinks of it. Because I hate that. It's really just a new atheist, centrist, liberal ploy to rein people in from the political right. And to rein people in from Christianity and a re-sacralization. Because these people are just as much a product of disenchantment as the left liberals that they're critiquing. Or the communists that they're critiquing. Although there's a complicated relationship, but the way that James Lindsay describes it is fundamentally mid-witted. That, oh, wokeness is a religion, it has the same rituals as religion, it promises you salvation, it gives you a system of belief. That's a very surface level understanding. Because unlike the sacred, the politics of the sacred that imply a whole organic worldview, like medieval Christianity, medieval Christendom that had its metaphysical system that then necessarily implied a monarchical politics, that then necessarily implied a politics that was suited for the greater metaphysical system of Christendom. But now that secularity has gotten rid of that, or claims to have gotten rid of that, by ushering, or rather placing religion into the private-public distinction, to where religion is no longer a public matter, people think of faith as a private thing. They think of faith as something that is of your own moral conscience that cannot cross over into the greater social apparatus. But to peoples around the world, and to our immediate ancestors even, this is nonsensical. Because how could you have a civilization without its underlying metaphysical structure? Whether it's Islam in the ancient world, Islam in medieval Islam, or the Arab world now, whether it's medieval Christianity and the various empires that came about the Renaissance, then later the Renaissance, where you have various imperial powers and city-states that were in keeping with the Catholic Church or even the Orthodox Church in the East after the fall of the Roman Empire. You have this commingling of political power and sacred power that is then called into question by various religious scholars and various sociologists and various academics that say that, that was all a cover for political power. When in reality, that distinction, that modern distinction, clouds our view of the ancients and of the medievals and even of the Renaissance. And then, of course, the religious beliefs around the world. Because even to this day, Tibet is run by a theocracy, a Buddhist theocracy. It clouds our view because it's really the other way around. It's that those metaphysical systems, those politics of the sacred, that then inform the politics of a civilization, a politics of everyday affairs, and the politics especially of the body. Because the woke-tards, they have got this correct, that the politics of the body will inevitably influence the politics of society in general. It's only that they have subscribed to a very anti-civilization force. So, when you have the sort of socio-political, aesthetic lowering of the metaphysical, of the sacred into the political, now that politics has informed everyday life. Politics, and I will talk about this in the later segment, politics is the consciousness of most people. Your identity is politicized. Your identity is fundamental to the social makeup of what is around you. The outside influences the inside. And this totalizing system of global liberalism or neoliberalism, or what I call transnational progressivism, is a hermetically sealed worldview that is exported throughout the world, that informs your subjectivity, that informs your belief. And what is the most sacred object, quote unquote, in this materialist, eminentized system? It is the body instead of the soul. So unlike critical theory or postmodern, or post-structuralism of Michel Foucault, that realizes the body is a construct, modern transnational progressivism in all of its forms, whether it be like race idolatry or, LGBT, CIA, politics, all of these things are taken up in a reification of the body, a reification of the self as a material being that is then submerged in these various information networks. There's a lot of feminist scholarship that talks about this that I could get into when I get home on like vital materialism, object-oriented ontology intersects with feminism in this way, that the material body is something that has the markings of the sacred but is no longer something metaphysical. It is eminentized. It is lowered into a single world system rather than a metaphysical or transcendental system in which there is a firmament of this world. There's a higher lower distinction, the axis mundi, above so below. All of those relations are brought down, kind of like Spinoza. And of course Spinoza is the groundwork of Deleuze and even the groundwork of a lot of critical theory nowadays. Because and not in the stupid James Lindsay, Hegel is modern wokeness. No, it's more of that eminentized system that even crosses over into pantheism, where the body and the material world are now the objects of transcendence, of an eminentized transcendence. This is why I think modern quote-unquote woke ideology or transnational progressivism, it is a materialist metaphysics. It is an eminentized materialist metaphysics. Because it has a whole worldview, it has a self-world system that dictates the politics of the self, that dictates your identity, that has a form of ritual. But also, in my book, I cover this a lot. Me and Matthew Stout were actually editing this part. It has, what is the currency of the self? What gives you the self in this modern materialist metaphysics that you could call like wokeism or transnational progressivism? What is it? It's the politics and the war, the culture war for representation. Representation in media becomes that which is the social currency that validates yourself. The way that grace or works in Christianity, the way that Dharma works in Buddhism and Hinduism, those are the things that validate the soul, that give you a form of divine verification. Or if there's no soul in Buddhism, I mean, there's a soul, there's a, the light body, the dharmic body in Hinduism that is then alleviated from when you achieve a state of moksha, and you realize that all of your whole self, the ahamkara is illusory, the veil of Maya is a necessary illusion of the material world, of the egoic I self, that is then transcended once you realize that you are the eternal self. When you achieve a state of moksha, you are that within Nirguna Brahman, that everything is Brahman according to Shankara and Vedanta Buddhism. That all these gods, that they are the elements of Brahman, right? That they all come together. And so Vedanta is Vedanta, I mean, there's a lot of scholars that, they quibble about like the difference between the Vedas and then later Vedanta under Shankara and under Ramanuja. So, but that's besides the point. The point being is that the validation of the self, if the soul is lowered into the material body by modern transnational progressivism or by wokeness or whatever, then you could say, have I been going on for an hour? Oh my God. Man, this is just flying by. Just flying by. Yeah, I've been going on for an hour. Then you could say that the way to validate the self, the body, in transnational progressivism, in the material metaphysics of our current total world picture that comes about with modern transnational progressive ideology, that has then has surpassed those faith systems and tried to liquidate the faith systems of the world by exporting modern secular Western liberalism that then disrupts these local identities, things that Condylis talks about. If you have been following that DA Digital Archipelago episode where you go over Condylis, there is a necessity for what he calls planetary politics, what you could call transnational progressivism. There is a necessity to disrupt, secularize, and liquidate these religious and mystical practices and what he called native identities throughout the world. that is bound up with what he called traditionalism. Traditional practices, traditional faiths, and nativist nationalist identities, they have to be dissolved by what he calls planetary politics for a reason. They have to be dissolved and they have to be called into question, because then the politics of this total worldview can freely invade and transform these societies and make them in some weird way mirror images of the post-religious, post-political even Western subject. And so this is what he talks about in his essay Planetary Politics After the Cold War. Because then after the Cold War, you have the end of history thesis, which is the basis of modern Western transnational progressivism. There is no alternative. The way that there is no alternative to the faith and civilizational faith of medieval Christendom or Islam in the Arab world, there really is no way of getting around them. That implies an imperial system of politics just as much as it implies a faith structure that takes care of the machinations of the soul, the state of the soul, but also that soul. And of course, in Christianity, this comes from Platonism, right? It comes from the Republic specifically, although Aristotle also talked about this on Politics, that the self is a microcosm of the greater civilization or the greater society, and that self gets taken up and vice versa. The state of the city is the state of the soul, and of course Aristotle, it differs from Plato, right, in the Republic, because in Aristotle, you have like phronesis, the ability to determine the mean. You have a very pro-aristocratic system, that a citizenry should be a citizenry of people that are worthy of that system, and that and that there's this whole worldview that is taken up by the politics of that society that interlinks with the politics and with the sacred itself. But nowadays we have the same enclosed total world system that is secularized, that had to claim that there's no other rival ideology or rival faith. And so now you have, in this weird way, a material metaphysics in modern transnational progressivism. But what does it mean? And Condylis will guide us to this. If we were to take the system that we live under as a planetary political system that is like a form of religiosity, not religion as a whole, because there is no soteriology, and I'll get to that. I'll explain why the sort of system is exhausted that led to the election of Donald J. Trump and other nationalist movements throughout the world. What does Condylis say? He says that traditionalism, what he calls traditionalism, nativist practices, nationalism, faith, a return to re-enchantment, those things disrupt what he calls planetary politics. But those things, in a weird, inverted way, becomes a form of antinomianism. What Charles Upton, the perennialist, called the counter-initiation. What even, St. Anthony would say when he said that quote, "There will be a day that comes where madness is treated as sanity, and people that are moral and people that do adhere to Christ's law, that they will be called insane." And so in the book, The Counter-Initiation, there is a antinomian inversion of the sacred and the profane. The profane becomes sacred, the sacred becomes profane. But I'll get to that. There was this Loki Julianus tweet that really piqued my interest, that talked about how there was this Orc brand thread in this Loki Julianus tweet. The Loki Julianus one talked about how modern progressive liberalism, how it really has no power against memetics, especially the memetics of the E-right. But I'll talk about that. And when but the reason I bring this up is because you have to realize, okay, really quickly, the politics of representation is that which validates the subject, because the subject, the soul, has been lowered to the body and to the self, or you're sort of like create your own identity. The politics of identity is the self in total. No longer is there a soul, there is a material self, but there's also a virtual self that engages in the politics of representation, and the validity of that soul, the new material soul, that is virtual, that is caught up in the, Byung-Chul Han talks about this with information and data, that you are this avatar that represents the self aesthetically through these various identity politics and identity complexes that are really the aesthetic affectations of the identity complex. That is what your soul is. The aesthetic, and I talk about this in my book, the soul to the modern transnational progressive liberal subject is the aesthetic. It is the body. If you transform your body, you transform yourself. But what is the inverted transgression against that total system of transnational progressivism? And the key to that, the thing that I discuss in my book, is when you look at the thing that validates the modern self, which is representation, media, and artistic, aesthetic representation that goes into slop entertainment, the culture industry, the society of the spectacle that DeBoard talks about. But I'll get to that. Let's take a little bit of a break, and then we'll get to it. So I was talking about Antinomianism and a secularized version of Antinomianism. There was an article I read about Antinomianism and Buddhism. In particular, this one branch of Japanese Pure Land by Josho, I believe that was his name, Josho, where it was his doctrine, the doctrine by the founder, I'm blanking on his name now, but basically it was like, if you worship this one deity, no matter what, you will get into the Pure Land, you will become enlightened, and Mahayana Buddhism, to which Pure Land, Pure Land is an extension of, I believe, so don't quote me on it, but I think that's the genealogy, correct? But essentially that if you get it, you worship this one particular deity, Mimbitsu, I believe Mimbitsu, yeah, that was the name of the Buddha, then you will automatically go into the Pure Land, kind of like in the Cathar, is how, as long as you repented, even at the end of your life, if you were a total sinner, that you will get to heaven, because this world is a hell. And that's why the Cathars were suppressed, because they had this bonkers theology that was totally heretical to everything else, right? That would just basically become one giant, massive moral hazard. Oh, but religious wars are evil. But anyways, whatever. You must silence the libtard within that tells you the Crusades are evil. They were not evil. I mean, some of them maybe were, but like by the time you did the Second and Third Crusade, I mean, it was basically a defensive war, but also the suppression of certain heretical sects that did have huge antinomian practices that led to all sorts of degenerate behavior. And so this Buddhist monk, some of his followers, they did some dirty business with the shogunate kings, harem women, and anyways. So then he was condemned, and these other monks were executed, I believe. But anyways, the point being is that there's a secular version of Antinomianism that has to relate to this concept of representation. Now, I know that Donald Trump and the growing right-wing reaction has really called into question this thing about media representation, but now these leftoids are clinging on to media literacy and representation in all forms of media more than ever before, because it is part of their secular eminentized metaphysics, their materialist metaphysics that is modern transnational progressivism and modern libtard belief, right? Whatever you want to call them, SJWs or woke or whatever. Woketards. I mean, I hate the term woke, but you know what I mean. Representation is almost like grace in Christianity, or specifically in Catholicism. And I believe Orthodoxy has their own conception of grace. But grace as an extension of let's go to Catholic phenomenology, right? This is stuff that my girlfriend, by the way, she when she was in grad school, she was immersed in this particular strain, right? Catholic phenomenology. Now, let's say that grace is a claim to being. That the validity, or rather the warranted true belief of your soul and your existence, your being that is thrown into the world, is engaged with the reality of grace. Grace is the sort of raft. You are on one shore, and it's sort of the raft that meets you halfway across the shore. Again, I'm using Mahayana Buddhist metaphors, the little vehicle and the great vehicle. But grace basically is the great vehicle. But of course, I mean, I know it's a perennialist comparison because there is no God the way that we conceive of God in Buddhism. But the point being is that if you were to compare the two, grace would be that greater vehicle. And that you are made in the image of God, and that you have the capacity for oneness with God, what the Orthodox call kenosis. But grace plays that role, because in Catholicism, unlike Protestantism, and I believe also in Orthodoxy, you have faith and good works. Grace is activated by faith. It attunes your being to the greater being of God, of Christ. And so grace is that greater vehicle for the lesser vehicle of your soul. Or rather, I should say, smaller vehicle within the greater vehicle. And I could go into the definitions of grace, but just off the top of my head, grace serves that function. Okay, so now we have this materialist metaphysics of the totalized system of planetary politics after the Cold War, of transnational progressivism, or what you want to call woketards or wokeness or whatever. I mean, wokeness doesn't really define or doesn't really capture a lot of the motivations, and other terms that people come up with certainly do fit a bill, but I think are also limiting. And plus, I can't really say those three-letter terms, but whatever. The point being is that transnational progressivism also entails an end. That is the planetary politics after the Cold War of the prevailing liberal world order. But that world order, as I've said in the previous section, has been transformed into a total worldview. That even though I disagree with the rationalists about that, oh, this is a religion, it's not a religion, but certainly you could say that it is a enclosed materialist metaphysical system. It's an eminentized system of belief. And you could say that there are precursors to it, not in the way that James Lindsay said that Hegel created wokeness, Spinoza. I mean, there's probably a claim to Spinoza disrupted the relations of the celestial order, of the sort of divine hierarchy, by lowering those transcendence into an eminentized structure that then led in. I mean, Deleuze was immensely inspired by Spinozism. And you know, so I think there's a long and complex intersection between the sacred and the political, or the metaphysical and the political. Now, what you have from Spinoza is an even more thoroughly secularized and really atheistic and godless system that still is a totality, that still is a meta-narrative, is not purely postmodern. Jordan Peterson's wrong. Okay, Weinstein's, they're wrong. Hillsdale College is wrong. They are not postmodernists. Okay, I will say this till I'm blue in the face. Okay, but they have a meta-narrative. They have an enclosed system that approximates a metaphysical system because it has a claim to being, and because it has a genealogy of being, and because it has a claim towards the optimal conditions of mankind. That is, in a lot of ways, an eternal present. So, when you really look at it, the current prevailing global liberal regime approximates a secular metaphysics, as I've said repeatedly. Now, what would be the antinomian element? Well, it would obviously be something like a postmodern right wing. I know that term postmodern right has been used and abused by leftards, and I know that people have described Jordan Peterson that way, but he really isn't. But I think the reason I say this is because it is using those same constructs of liquidating the solidity of meta-narratives. Even though the left has abandoned postmodernism, they've abandoned a lot of forms of new left thought, but the intelligent frogs can pick up some of those pieces and integrate it into a fugitive, what would you say, a revolutionary right wing that is very clever and that has an ability to, you know, evade detection and can use the tools of post-structuralism and postmodernism, the conceptual tools, against the prevailing global liberal, transnational progressive Transy regime. And the reason there is an antinomianism to it is precisely if representation, if media representation, if the representation of all peoples makes a claim to being that legitimizes one's identity. Because now, as I've said before in the previous section, identity is equated with the self. You create your own self. That is the farthest postmodern that you can get. But then, unlike real postmodernism, the self becomes another molar identity, what Deleuze would call a molar identity, right? It becomes an identity construct that then makes a claim towards your being. The grace of the greater other, the greater holistic enclosed system of being that is the regime that we live under, the ideology that we live under, the legitimizing force akin to a secularized form of grace is representation. Media literacy is basically the sort of politics of recognition that you could say comes from Hegel, although Hegel is more complicated than people like James Lindsay will make it, right? But the point being is that representation, or rather recognition, this is something that we at Thermodor magazine talked about back in the day. That the political left, and there's works like Leviathan, there's even Alexander Kojev, who is a big structural thinker when it comes to what we would call transnational progressivism. His work in Hegelian Marxism, to them abandoned it to become a libtard bureaucrat in the EU, recognition operates as a form of grace. Representation or recognition that legitimizes the individual identities of each of its participants. Now, you know how the apocryphals are those who are against the traditional understandings of the church. And also, the antinomians are the ones who are against, or rather work to undermine, the grace of the divine, because unlike in the Catholic context, which is the one I'm most familiar with, if you violate that constituent element of faith and good works by saying that there's this that you can basically let speed run, you can have a hack master, a lore or what do they call it? That you can have a no exploit master, cheat code, no clip into divinity that antinomian practices, promise people. Then you have a situation where that relationship between your own being and the being of the greater other, which is the Lord, through grace, those things are complicated. They are called into question, because then a lot of these heretical, sects of Christianity, or even in the Buddhist or Hindu context, they would say that there isn't the need for grace, or rather, one can create a condition of grace on their own. Whereas we know that Christ creates the condition of grace. Okay, but that's theology, right? So there's a lot of heretical practices and sects that would say that, grace, there's no need for grace. By faith alone, you become like Christ, you become as Christ rather than like Christ. Some of the stuff that Fritjof Schuon was saying, well, there's a form of self-worship and autotheism right there, right? You are God, right? And even a lot of these New Agers that take something entirely, well, I would say somewhat innocent from people like Ram Dass, that says, you are God, and I am that. Thou art. How does it go in Hindu Sanskrit? Tav tar tat, you are that, or I am that. In the Christian context, those notions, they're dangerously heretical. Now, I'm not as knee-jerk as other people, because I was a New Ager, and so I'm not as repellent as for example, there are some Orthodox people that they're this is totally evil and it's all evil, but I think in terms of entertaining things intellectually, that's another story, right? But when it comes down to it, let's take these matters of theology when it comes to grace, and now let's bring it, and my book covers this, now let's bring it to the eminentized secular materialist metaphysics of transnational progressivism, and how representation operates as a form of grace. Now think of the one thing that cannot be legitimized that is a total state of exception, that is the Muslim, that is abandoned to bare life, that is abandoned to every element of humanity. the thing that cannot be represented in a positive life and cannot be given a form of being through media literacy or representation. The one thing that cannot be legitimized. What is that in our world? It is anything of the political right. The political right, whatever it may be, from the red pill manosphere to conservatards to incels, not that a lot of incels are not necessarily on the right, but to religious trads, to fascists, to other forms of fascism on the far right. These are the things that cannot be given representation, only that which is the denial or denouncing. The partial denunciation of bringing, right-wing ideas to the public view only to condemn and denounce them. What Freud called limited, sublimated denouncement. Where you take the object of psychic pain and denouncing, which he usually meant sexual taboos, and you bring them to the awareness of the psyche only to then denounce it, instead of a total denial or a total denunciation where you don't even bring up these things altogether. And so a lot of religious trads unfortunately do have that complex of I'm bringing something up to then later condemn it, right? Not to say that Freudianism is a total be-all and end-all, and there's certainly a lot of problems with Freud, and Freud certainly did have, let's say without getting too much into it, vested interests into complicating Christian morality, right? That he was exposed to in Europe. But that being said, the right wing can never be fully given over to legitimacy through representation. Therefore, the right wing operates totally outside of those politics of representation and operates totally outside of the mechanisms, the secular media information or dataism mechanisms of representation. For example, Google excluding right-wing sources, even if they're totally valid. People say that even in information and search engines can have forms of Alzheimer's or dementia. That is for a reason. That is because the mechanisms of curation when it comes to search results, when it comes to suggestions, are totally broken for political reasons. Meaning that the legitimacy of the right wing in terms of information, which is, again, integral to power knowledge, even though the left has in some ways abandoned, key elements of Foucauldianism while retaining or harping on other ones, you could say that the sort of information nexuses of power knowledge are denied to the right wing. That in that element of power knowledge, if it is attached as quote unquote the right, then it's illegitimate knowledge. But how could there be illegitimate knowledge? It's just knowledge, right? You remember that old Kohler scam on YouTube, those commercials, those advertisements? Knowledge, right? Remember? I'm in my car. Here's my car. I read books. Even though he probably doesn't. But the point being is that if knowledge is illegitimate, and knowledge is integral to identity in a variety of reasons that Foucault goes into, and if representation acts as a form of grace under the totalizing system that we live under, then you could say that if all rightist thought is illegitimate, either in terms of media representation or in terms of the creation of knowledge, then you could say that the right wing is an antinomian force to the transnational progressive world system. That nativist knowledges, nationalism, ethnic identities that are not given their little form of Potemkin Village Disneyland nationalism. Like, indigenous people are given it, but then they're also not fully given it, because it's like, for example, if you go to Canadian subreddits, they say it's terribly racist that the price of a box of Pop-Tarts in Nunavut is $30 to ship a box of Pop-Tarts. But shouldn't you be hunting seals? Shouldn't you be participating in those traditional knowledge systems? Or Métis knowledge, as James Scott, C. Scott, called it. Shouldn't you be, if you want to go back to traditional ways of living, now I understand the indigenous people, a lot of them have been broken by modernity, of course. But shouldn't there be a reintegration of their traditional ways of being? The point being is that the fetishism over indigenous rights and indigenous identity is really just a way of destroying a Canadian, a European-derived Canadian identity in the Canadian context. It's really not about Native people, indigenous people themselves. It's really just about calling into question, even destroying the potentiality for Canadians to have an identity onto themselves. Like this article that I'm going to cover in the Cole Report. So, the right wing is heretical. The right wing are the real antinomians to this secularized, cult-like metaphysical system that may approximate faith in certain regards, but in not others. Because again, the intellectual dork web, they're totally wrong when they just blanket statement, wokeness is like a religion. But yet the right wing cannot be represented in media. It's only represented in terms of denial and denouncement. You can't have a character that is in a true sense a right-wing or even conservative person. Because even those characters that are conservative are only there to subvert people's viewership that are potentially right-wing or conservative. That are basically the kayfabe heels to the regime. Meaning they are not authentically right-wing in their beliefs. Religious people are always evil, and the ones that aren't are basically just libtards. Ron Swanson, Stephen Colbert, I'm pretending to be a conservative, to subvert conservatism, to subvert what they think is right-wing thought. All the Austrian painters are handsome and well put together, but yet they're, media literacy dictates that you're not supposed to root for them. You're not supposed to root for that guy in Inglourious Bastards. You're not supposed to root for Patrick Bateman. You're not supposed to root for, Joker is complicated, but whatever. Even Joker they subverted. What was always going to happen? Really, do you even want, and this is the thing about antinomianism, about right-wing antinomianism to the secular progressive faith, or rather belief system. Do you want to be represented in media? Do you want to have your mass slop version of a right wing that fetishizes mass consumption culture industry? Is it better to be excluded by the culture industry rather than a sham of identity and representation? Is it better to be a heretic to the current culture industry, the current transnational progressive libtard world order? Is it better to be that than to be subsumed into just another identity among others? That you're going to have your little identity, your little Disneyland nationalism, you're going to have your little ethno-state, you're going to have raw egg Vitalist cookbooks in Walmart. You're going to be you're going to fight for representation like all the other identity groups in the progressive stack. Do you want that as a right-winger? Or do you want to be a total iconoclast and say enough's enough and overthrow those liberal assumptions and overthrow ideologically the system of planetary politics after the Cold War, to create a new system. That is what the E-right and the greater right wing has to really contend with. Because even that term dissident right has been taken over by people with nefarious interests, who are face lords, who rob the ideas of people. I mean, I'm a face, but whatever. You know what I mean? I'm talking about other people, like the, not to name names, but one of them was caught up in a little scandal recently that we have to pretend, is scalping all of these professors and academics. The point being is that the forces, the label dissident right, from Curtis Yarvin to Chris Rufo to like other like Claremont Kohlers or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of good people in Claremont, but there's other people that I'm skeptical of. The point being is that there has to be a different system. There has to be a different way. There has to be a calling into question of Tronzy at its root, out of its beliefs, rather than just wanting to be quote unquote represented. Do you want to have that grace of the world system of planetary politics given over to you? Or do you want to have something different? Do you just want to be represented? That is the real question. And so let me take a little break and we'll get back to other exciting content. So, yeah. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantairproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every Content Minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.